This is a new video about the promotion of FDI as a market-orientated strategy to create economic growth and economic development. So, what is FDI? FDI stands for Foreign Direct Investment. It describes a process whereby a firm in one country undertakes capital expenditure in another. Another way of looking at FDI is that it enables a business in one country to purchase assets in another country. FDI can be inbound or outbound. The image shows FDI made by the Great Indian Peninsula Railway, which was incorporated as a company way back in 1849 with its head office in London. This private company built a railway in India in order to profit from demand for rail transport amongst Indians. It's important to recognise that nobody forced Indians to purchase tickets and travel by train. However, those that did so of their own free will, because from their perspective, the amount of money that they spent on the train ticket was less than the benefit that they derived from being able to travel. It's an example of the free market in action. In the free market, all exchange takes place on a voluntary basis, including FDI. An example of outbound FDI from the UK would be Dyson's decision to build a vacuum cleaner factory in Malaysia. Outbound FDI creates a currency outflow on the financial and capital account of the balance of payments. Inbound FDI occurs when a foreign company purchases a British company or develops UK-based business assets. A classic example is Jaguar Land Rover, which has been a subsidiary of Tata Motors of India since they bought it in 2008. So when Tata invests in a new production line in Britain, that's an example of inbound FDI. So it's money that's moving into Britain on the financial and capital account. The picture shows new hotels and office blocks built in Tel Aviv, Israel. They're all financed using Chinese loanable funds. So this is an example of outbound FDI from China that's flowing into the Israeli economy. So why are the Chinese developing assets in Israel? Well, the Chinese clearly hope to profit from owning these assets because they'll receive unearned income every year as a consequence of owning these assets in the form of leases or rental income. In a world where capital is internationally mobile, capital will move to wherever rates of return are highest, to wherever there's most profit on offer. And this is one of the classic features of globalization. In today's globalized world, there's far more FDI than there used to be. And as I say, the main thing about FDI is that firms will invest anywhere where the rates of profit are highest, and capital will generally migrate to the locations where the rates of profit, the rates of return are the highest, and move away obviously from locations where rates of return are lower. Say why it might work. So what we're going to look at here is the arguments in favour of the notion that FDI might help to create economic growth and economic development. So let's imagine that we've got an economy in equilibrium because the level of aggregate demand is constant at AD1. This economy will be achieving an equilibrium level of GDP of MY1. Now, to create economic growth and development, we'll need to get GDP up. How could FDI contribute towards that? Well, I think the first reason is that investment will typically increase the productivity of labour within an economy. So if labour has better machinery to use, that will mean that labour can produce more in the same time, because capital intensive methods of production normally speed up the rate at which output is produced. So that's why investment, FDI, will shift the long run aggregate supply curve from LRAS1 to LRAS2. So FDI will increase the productive capacity of an economy. It's also important to realise, though, that FDI will add to aggregate demand. This is because private sector investment is a component of AD. So the end result then is that FDI creates both an increase in AD and an increase in LRAS, and as a result of that we'll get economic growth here of MY1 to MY2. When provided the rate of economic growth is faster than the rate of population growth, that will lead to higher per capita incomes and therefore an improvement in the material standard of living. Another argument that you could put forward is that FDI can help a country to overcome a savings gap. So this is obviously tapping into the Harrod-Domar model of economic growth. If you're not so certain about that, maybe you should watch the video on the Harrod-Domar before you continue any further. So let's assume that you have watched that, and let's dig into this in a bit more detail then. So it's often said that low-income developing countries are too poor to save. As a result of that, they'll tend to suffer from domestic savings gaps. A savings gap describes a situation where a country's savings ratio isn't high enough to fund the investment levels required to achieve a desired rate of economic growth. FDI can help a country to fill a domestic savings gap because the savings that are used to fund FDI come from abroad by definition. Another related argument in favour of FDI is that it can help a developing country to escape all of the problems that are associated with primary product dependency. Foreign loanable funds in the form of FDI can help to fund the capital investment in manufacturing that's needed to diversify the economy of a primary product dependent developing country. The main advantage of this approach of funding the investment needed to industrialise using foreign loanable funds rather than domestic loanable funds is that already poor people in developing countries aren't going to be asked to forego what pitifully low levels of consumption that they already have in order to make this industrialisation possible, because the loanable funds are going to come from abroad rather than from domestic households. Knowledge transfer. FDI doesn't just bring money into a country, it can also bring knowledge too. This can even apply in a developed country context. So taking the example of Nissan's FDI in Sunderland, they built a big car factory there. It wasn't just the investment in physical capital that benefited the British economy. The Japanese also brought enlightened managerial attitudes and operations management techniques such as just-in-time and Kaizen and lean production, and Nissan had to educate its British suppliers in its philosophies in order to obtain the high quality components needed to produce high quality cars in its new factory. So there was knowledge transfer taking place there. The image shows this Japanese management practice of getting employees to exercise together in the morning. The idea being that it fosters team working and it breaks down them and us barriers between managers and workers. and by doing that, that will lift productivity. You could also argue that FDI can help to create positive multiplier effects and better paid employment opportunities. So again, if you think about the positive multiplier effects, if James Dyson builds a vacuum cleaner factory in Malaysia, then Dyson will need to purchase plastic pellets. Maybe those plastic pellets come from a Malaysian supplier, so the Malaysian supplier will pick up business. Maybe they have to take on extra staff as a result of that. Those staff will now have a better wage to spend, and that might benefit the local street food vendor. It's also important to recognise that although the wages paid by multinationals in a developing world might appear to be low by our standards, they're often considerably better paid jobs than the ones that are available locally in places like Malaysia. So you could also argue that FDI, yes, it creates jobs. Dyson will need some workers to work inside his factory, but we're also saying that those jobs that Dyson creates are often a hell of a lot better paid than the alternatives. But Marxists don't really tend to understand that sort of nuance. What they'll do instead is they'll look at the wage paid by Dyson to his Malaysian workers and then compare it against the wages that are being paid to US factory workers and cry exploitation. Another argument in favour of FDI is that the economic growth created by FDI will create a tax windfall for the state. If growth creates a bigger economy, so there's more production and economic activity for the state to tax. So even the same tax rate will collect more tax income in total for the government to spend. So this opens up all sorts of possibilities for development, because the government of the host country that's received the FDI could choose to spend the tax windfall created on state hospitals or schools, and that would increase life expectancy and mean years of schooling respectively, both of which would create a positive impact for the Human Development Index. Multinationals will also pay corporation tax on the profits that they've made to the governments that have hosted them. So let's review some of these important logic chains then about how FDI might trigger economic growth and economic development. So we know already that FDI increases both aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. So it will create long-run economic growth. If the rate of economic growth is faster than the rate of population growth, per capita incomes will rise. Higher incomes will increase consumption possibilities. That will generate material progress, which in turn triggers economic development. Another route through is, yes, FDI boosts AD and AS, creates growth. So the extra growth will generate tax revenues because the foreign companies operating in the country have to pay corporation tax, and the governments can spend the tax windfall generated by FDI on health and education. That will then increase life expectancy and mean years of schooling, triggering economic development. Another argument is that if you have FDI in your country, the multinationals moving into your country, they'll need labour to work with the machinery that they've bought. So the derived demand for labour will increase in the host country. That will lead to higher wage rates and higher employment levels. That will lead to raised levels of living and therefore economic development. That might be a very, very important point actually, because in many developing countries there's no welfare state. So there's a huge connection between unemployment and poverty. So if multinationals can come in and exploit, I mean that ironically, poor people in developing countries and exploit them by providing them a job that pays a wage, so that person now has some money to live off, that might actually save their life. Another aspect of it is that FDI can create knowledge transfer. That will then reduce the capital output ratio, which will sort of speed up growth. At this point, we'll have a quick aside and look at something slightly different and interesting. The picture, just in case you're wondering, isn't some sort of fabricated image. It's actually a picture of Taiwan. Many British kids will just assume that Taiwan's dirt poor. The truth of the matter is that it's not. Many countries in the developing world have overtaken the UK and now have better standards of living. So our aside is going to be, what can governments do to increase or attract FDI into their country? First idea is really basic. It's just a way of thinking about this, is that if you can increase the profitability of investing in your country, then for reasons of self-interest, more multinationals will want to locate in your country rather than elsewhere. So all of these ideas basically stem from that premise. So we could cut rates of corporation tax. Remember, corporation tax is a tax on profits. Second thing that we could do is try to increase public sector capital spending on infrastructure. So if you can improve the supply of electricity and you can make your broadband faster, that reduces the cost of doing business in your country. And by reducing the cost of doing business in your country, it also makes it more profitable to invest in your country. You could pay subsidies. That would obviously increase profitability. You could pass laws that reduce the power of trade unions, because if trade unions became less powerful, it may well be that you might find wages in your country falling. Lower wages will lower costs and therefore make it more profitable to invest in your country rather than in another country that's got higher wages because they've got more powerful unions. You could also deregulate labour markets by making it easier to hire and fire workers, or maybe you could abolish minimum wages that are pricing workers out of their own jobs. You could also go for price liberalization. So let market forces determine prices rather than central planners. So it may well be the case at the moment you're not really attracting much inbound FDI because you've set maximum prices at very, very low levels, at levels that are just really too low for anybody to make any profit from. So surprise, surprise, if you're doing that, you're not really going to attract much FDI. Improving educational standards will also help too, because it will boost productivity, and higher levels of productivity will make it more profitable for multinationals to invest in your country rather than in other countries where productivity is lower because educational standards are less good. So what we're going to look at now is some counter arguments. So how could you argue that FDI might not create economic growth or economic development? The first argument is technical. FDI will boost GDP, but it won't boost GNI. So why is that? Well, if you remember, GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced within your economy during the last year. So that will include the output of foreign-owned businesses. GNI, on the other hand, is the total value of output produced by all businesses that are owned by your own domestic nationals. So it's the income the total factor income that flows to the citizens of a particular country. So in the case of Dyson, building a factory in Malaysia will increase Malaysian GDP because the factory is based in Malaysia, but it won't increase Malaysian GNI because the profits made from the factory are going to flow out of Malaysia back to the UK. And this is important in the sense that the HDI measures per capita incomes using GNI rather than GDP. Another counter argument you could make is, well, this idea that FDI is going to create jobs in the host country. This is all terribly outdated because these days we've got the fourth industrial revolution kicking in, and the only jobs that FDI are going to create is jobs for robots. FDI could also cause external costs which damage environmental goods, leading to a fall in the non-material quality of life. So the image shows the externalities allegedly produced by FDI undertaken by global giants like Shell. Shell will be interested in maximizing its return on investment. Shell's not really going to be too interested in negative externalities. It's just going to be focusing more on its private costs and making profit. Some people believe that if there's a gap between rich and poor in a country, that can worsen the quality of life. So how could you argue that FDI could worsen inequality? Well, I guess you could say that multinationals that invest abroad, the jobs that they create aren't particularly numerous. The people that receive those jobs or get those jobs are often paid fantastic salaries compared to other local people who don't work for the multinational. FDI could also put local firms out of business. So the bigger a business is, the more economies of scale that business can achieve. Economies of scale are factors that cause average costs to fall when a business grows larger in the long run. So you might have a global giant like KFC. They've got huge bulk buying economies of scale, for example. So they might move to invest, do some FDI in places like the Czech Republic. That FDI might take the form of opening up branches in downtown Prague. And as a result of that new competition, local Czech fast food sellers might be forced out of business because they can't match the prices of KFC, because they can't match the costs of KFC, because they don't have the economies of scale of KFC, because they're a lot smaller than KFC. You could also argue that FDI can be damaging in terms of growth and development because it can lead to currency appreciation. Floating exchange rates come into equilibrium where the supply of a currency equals the demand for it. So on the diagram here, we would have an equilibrium quantity of currency traded of Q1 and an equilibrium exchange rate of ER1. So if there's lots of inbound FDI into a country, the demand for that country's assets are going to increase, because that's what FDI essentially is. Foreigners rock up to your country and they purchase your assets off you. So that might be just something simple like purchasing land from somebody so that they can build a factory on it. Either way, there's going to be an increase in the demand for your assets. That will increase the demand for your currency. To buy, for example, land in Britain, a foreigner would have to purchase sterling on foreign currency markets to pay the Brit what he or she wants for the land that they've got to sell. So as a consequence of that increase in the demand for your currency on Forex markets, the equilibrium will change. The equilibrium quantity of your currency traded will go up from Q1 to Q2, and your currency will appreciate from ER1 to ER2. And that appreciation will increase the price of your exports and reduce the price of your imports. So as a result of that currency appreciation, that will damage the international price competitiveness of local firms in your economy. That they'll struggle to export and they'll struggle to fight off competition from abroad in their domestic market, because foreign goods just look cheaper, because your currency is appreciated, because your economy has just been hit with this wall of foreign money, blasting your foreign currency market, increasing the demand for your currency. So what does the effects of FDI depend on? In what circumstances might it lift development or might not lift development? What does it depend on? I think the first thing to consider is the type of FDI that's taking place. So good FDI would be a foreign multinational building a factory in your country. The factory will increase the productive capacity of your economy. It'll create jobs. There'll be some multiplier effects for local firms that supply the factory. The workers that work in the factory will need lunch, and maybe they'll need some restaurant food and drinks on a Friday evening. It'll add to the local economy. On the other hand, bad FDI tends to be more short-term and speculative, and it doesn't really add to the capacity of the economy. So maybe a good example of that could be foreigners partaking in a domestic property bubble, a speculative bubble in property. So again, it depends on what are the foreign nationals investing in. So the chart shows what the Chinese have been purchasing in Africa. So you can see, I would say that this looks pretty good FDI that's beneficial for Africa. So the Chinese are funding investments in business services, retailing, construction, mining. It looks quite good to me. The approach of the government that's hosting the FDI also will have a bearing on whether the FDI is beneficial or not. So if you take Amazon, for example, there's been a lot of FDI into Britain by Amazon. They've built distribution centres all over Britain. Amazon have made decent amounts of profit from the UK. But again, allegedly, if you read the newspapers, Amazon have used legal tax evasion to ensure that they don't really pay too much tax in Britain. So you could argue, well, theoretically, FDI will create a tax windfall for governments to spend, but if that host government, for one reason or another, fails to tax the multinational that's operating in its country properly, then what's the point? You could argue that maybe the taxpayer ends up losing out net, because Amazon will use the roads, they'll benefit from employing people that were educated in state schools. So Amazon is a consumer of UK infrastructure. They benefit from UK infrastructure. But because the UK government allows them to pay very little corporation tax, the taxpayer's not really getting anything back from Amazon. So the business culture of the multinational that's doing the FDI is also important too. So if you take Nissan and its investment in its factory in Sunderland, Nissan have been there for over 20 years. They've built, as it says there, 10 million cars in Sunderland. They're in it for the long term. If there's a recession, it doesn't matter. Nissan will, they'll keep the factory open. They believe in loyalty. That's part of their culture. On the other hand, BMW, they're more short-termist than Nissan, in my humble opinion. So when they bought Rover and there was a recession, the first thing that they did was that they closed down the factory in Birmingham rather than thinking about closing any factories down in Munich. So that's another interesting aspect of FDI. What does the impact depend on? It depends on the business culture of the firm that's doing the investing. So in summary then, does FDI create growth and development? My answer would be yes, it does. The great benefit of FDI is that it's an example of capitalism. No one forces anybody to buy and sell assets. If the transaction is to take place, both the buyer and the seller must be benefiting, because if they weren't, the FDI wouldn't take place. In contrast, you could look at imperialism in the past. The British Empire seized assets overseas at the point of a gun. That's not FDI. That's called looting, and there's a huge difference. One's voluntary, one's based on coercion.